There is a number sitting inside a government report that most people will never read. A number so specific, so measurable, and so quietly alarming that when energy analysts first encountered it in formal grid reliability projections, several of them described the same reaction. Not panic, not dismissal. Something quieter than both. The particular dread of someone who has spent years studying a system and has just watched a line cross a threshold they hoped it would not cross for another decade. The number is 6 gigawatts. That is the size of the gap. The projected shortfall between the electricity that PJM Interconnection, the largest power grid operator in the United States, the system that keeps the lights on for 65 million people across 13 states, stretching from Illinois to North Carolina, will be able to reliably supply by 2027, and the electricity those same 65 million people and their increasingly AI-dependent infrastructure will actually need. Joe Bowring, president of Independent Market Monitor Monitoring Analytics, told CNBC that he has never seen the grid under such projected strain in his career. "It's at a crisis stage right now," he said. "PJM has never been this short." And Bowring is not a person given to exaggeration. He runs an organization whose entire purpose is to deliver accurate, unsentimental assessments of grid reliability. When someone like that uses the word crisis, the word has earned its place in the sentence. 6 gigawatts does not sound like a civilization-scale number until you understand what it represents in physical terms. It is the equivalent of removing 6 large power plants from the grid simultaneously, not during a planned maintenance window with advance notice and rerouted power, simultaneously, at peak demand, in the middle of a summer heatwave, with no backup available and no alternative ready to fill the gap. That is not a technical inconvenience. That is a failure condition. And the reason that gap exists, the reason grid analysts are using language they have not used before, is not a drought or a hurricane or a regulatory miscalculation. It is artificial intelligence, or more precisely, it is the physical infrastructure required to make artificial intelligence function. The data centers, the server farms, the cooling systems, the interconnected machinery of computation that has been built at a speed and scale that the electrical infrastructure surrounding it was never designed to absorb. This is where the story begins, but it is not where it ends. Because the power grid crisis that most people are dimly aware of in the way you are aware of things you read in headlines, and then forget by the following morning, is not, it turns out, the most dangerous part of what is actually happening. The most dangerous part is what the crisis has revealed about the systems layered underneath it. The systems that were built for a quieter world. The systems that were never designed to handle what is being asked of them now. And the systems that certain actors, in certain offices in certain countries, have been studying very carefully for a very long time. Part 1. The machine that ate the grid. To understand how we arrived at this particular moment, you need to understand something about the relationship between artificial intelligence and electricity that the public conversation around AI has almost entirely skipped. The conversation tends to focus on what AI can do, what it can generate, what it can predict, what it can automate, what jobs it might replace, what new capabilities it might unlock. These are real questions worth serious attention, but they are questions about the output of a system, and almost no one is talking about the input. Every time you ask an AI system a question, every conversation, every generated image, every automated decision made quietly on your behalf by a system you may not even know is present, a machine somewhere has to think. And thinking, for a machine, is not a metaphor or a poetic approximation. It is a physical process. It is electrons moving through silicon at temperatures that require active management. It is heat being generated in quantities that would surprise most people who have never stood inside a data center. It is cooling systems working continuously to dissipate that heat before it damages equipment worth tens of millions of dollars. And all of it, every step of that process, requires electricity. More electricity than most people would find comfortable to contemplate. The International Energy Agency published its report on energy and AI in April 2025, and the numbers it contains are worth reading slowly. Data centers consumed approximately 415 terawatt-hours of electricity globally in 2024. Put that in context, that is roughly 1.5% of the entire world's electricity supply consumed by data centers alone, a number that has been growing at 12% per year for the last 5 years. 12% compounding annually is not gradual growth, it is acceleration, and acceleration does not slow itself down. A typical AI-focused hyperscaler, the kind of massive facility that companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Meta operate across Virginia and Texas and Oregon and a dozen other states, uses as much electricity annually as 100,000 American households. One facility, one building, or complex of buildings, with its rows of servers and its cooling systems and its uninterruptible power supplies, and its diesel backup generators. 100,000 homes worth of electricity, running continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the largest facilities currently under construction, the IEA reports, are expected to use 20 times that, 20 times 100,000 households, 2 million homes from a single facility. There are now more than 5,000 data centers in the United States, according to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. 5,000 buildings, ranging from modest server rooms to campuses the size of small towns, all consuming electricity at various points on a scale that would have seemed implausible 10 years ago. And the companies building them are not slowing down, they are accelerating. In 2024, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta collectively spent over $200 billion on capital expenditures. That figure represents a 62% year-over-year increase from 2023. Each firm's spending reached an all-time high. Amazon's capital expenditures were $85.8 billion, up 78% year-over-year. Microsoft's were $44.5 billion, Google's were $52.5 billion, Meta's were $39.2 billion. Looking ahead, Amazon's total capital spending for 2025 is projected to surpass $100 billion. These are not numbers from a sector that is moderating its ambitions. These are numbers from a sector that has decided the infrastructure race is existential and that restraint is a form of defeat. The Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, in an analysis published in February 2026, observed that unlike past gradual and dispersed growth in electricity demand, the current surge from data centers is rapid, lumpy, and increasingly clustered around specific localities, leading to increased concerns around demand-supply mismatch, insufficient energy reserve margins, and transmission congestion. The electricity system that exists today was not built for this. It was built for a world where demand grew slowly and predictably over decades, a world where utility planners could see large new loads arriving years in advance and prepare the necessary infrastructure methodically, a world where the biggest unexpected surges in electricity demand came from heat waves or cold snaps that lasted days, not from permanent, unceasing, mathematically relentless consumption by facilities that never sleep, never cycle down, and never stop generating heat regardless of the hour or the season. Deloitte's 2025 AI Infrastructure Survey, which gathered responses from 120 US-based power company and data center executives, found that 79% of respondents believe AI will increase power demand through 2035 due to widespread adoption. And their projections for that demand are striking. US data center power capacity sat at 33 gigawatts in 2024. Deloitte projects it will reach 41 gigawatts by the end of 2025. By 2030, that number climbs to 120 gigawatts. By 2035, 176 gigawatts. The grid is being asked to more than triple in a decade. A grid that, for the 2 decades preceding this one, had grown accustomed to nearly flat demand. The period from approximately 2000 to 2020 was, by historical standards, a remarkably quiet one for electrical planners. Improvements in efficiency roughly kept pace with growth in consumption. The system was stable. New generation was built at a measured pace. Interconnection queues moved at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say, slowly, but without crisis. That stillness is over, and the speed of the transition has caught nearly everyone off guard, including the people whose professional responsibility is to not be caught off guard. Deloitte's survey found that grid stress was the leading challenge identified by data center infrastructure developers. Not land acquisition costs, not permitting delays, not construction material shortages, not labor availability. The grid, the fundamental infrastructure of electricity delivery that an entire civilization depends upon, was identified by the people building the systems that are straining it as the primary obstacle to their own expansion. There is something worth pausing on in that. The industry that is creating the grid problem has correctly identified the grid problem as its own largest constraint, and that clarity of perception has not, at least not yet, translated into a corresponding slowdown in the behaviours that are creating the problem. The buildings are still going up, the servers are still being ordered, the power contracts are still being signed, and the grid is still being asked to deliver what it was not built to deliver on a timeline that leaves very little room for the kind of careful, deliberate infrastructure development that reliable power systems require. In the PJM region alone, the projected 6 gigawatt shortfall by 2027 represents a gap between what the market has committed to supply and what the demand projections say will be needed. PJM Interconnection has taken the unprecedented step of running what it calls a Reliability Resource Initiative, drawing 94 applications for new generation resources and ultimately selecting 51 projects to address near-term electricity demand growth. 51 new power generation projects, chosen specifically because the existing pipeline of resources was not sufficient to meet the demand that AI data centers are bringing online. And all of this, every statistic and every projection, and every panicked industry survey, describes a situation that was already difficult before anyone added the second layer. The layer that the infrastructure crisis has inadvertently created by concentrating so much critical function in facilities that are, by their nature, targets. The AI infrastructure boom has not just strained the power grid, it has made the power grid matter in a way it has never mattered before, and things that matter at scale attract a particular kind of attention from a particular kind of actor. That attention is not theoretical, it is documented, it is measurable, and it has been growing at a pace that mirrors, with uncomfortable symmetry, the pace of AI data center construction itself. The story of the grid crisis is not just about how much electricity AI needs, it is about what happens to a civilization when the systems that deliver that electricity are simultaneously being pushed beyond their design limits and quietly, patiently, methodically studied by adversaries who have noticed exactly which threads, if pulled, would cause the largest possible unravelling. That is the part that forecasters are only beginning to say out loud, and the part they are most reluctant to say is the part that deserves the most careful attention. Part 2. When the grid becomes a target. Here is where the story changes character in a way that requires a different kind of attention, because the power grid crisis, understood purely as an infrastructure and supply problem, is genuinely serious. 6 gigawatts of projected shortfall is a real number describing a real problem with real consequences for real people who depend on a reliable electricity supply for everything from keeping their refrigerators cold to keeping hospital ventilators running. But infrastructure problems, at least in principle, have infrastructure solutions. You build more generation capacity, you upgrade transmission lines, you modernize the interconnection process so that new power plants can actually deliver electricity to the grid in a reasonable time frame. You develop storage systems that can smooth out the peaks and valleys of supply and demand. These are slow processes. They're expensive. They involve political negotiations and regulatory proceedings and engineering timelines that frustrate everyone who encounters them. But they are solvable, in the language of engineering and public investment, given sufficient time and sufficient will. What cannot be solved with engineering alone is the second layer of this problem, the layer that the infrastructure crisis has inadvertently created by making the grid more important, more concentrated, and more thoroughly interwoven with digital systems than it has ever been before in the history of the American electrical network. Consider what has actually been built in the last several years. Tens of thousands of megawatts of computing infrastructure clustered in specific geographic locations, drawing power from specific grid interconnection points, dependent on specific transmission corridors, cooled by specific water systems, managed by software running on networks that are, by the nature of software networks, connected to everything. Data centers that serve as the backbone of cloud computing, of financial market infrastructure, of hospital record systems, of supply chain logistics, of military and intelligence applications, of the communication networks that emergency response systems depend upon. All of it concentrated, all of it dependent on electricity, and all of it, as a consequence of being concentrated and dependent and deeply integrated with every other critical system in the country, presenting a target profile that is categorically different from anything that existed before. The energy grid faces persistent and thoroughly documented threats from cybercriminal groups, hacktivist organizations, and nation-state actors operating with the resources and patience that only a government can sustain. This is not speculation drawn from theoretical threat models. It is the stated on-record assessment of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and every major intelligence organization that has publicly commented on critical infrastructure security in the last decade. And in 2025, new research began to describe, in specific and measurable terms, how the AI-driven expansion of data center infrastructure has fundamentally altered the character and the scale of that threat. AI data centers are not passive structures that happen to use large quantities of electricity. They are active participants in grid operations in ways that earlier generations of large industrial facilities were not. They connect to the grid through interconnection points that are highly specific and relatively concentrated. They create what the Deloitte survey described as large, concentrated clusters of 24-hour power demand. The same Deloitte survey documented that leading data center growth regions have already experienced harmonic distortions on the power grid, load relief warnings, near-miss incidents, and in some cases generation shutdowns. These are not hypothetical failure scenarios drawn from risk modeling exercises. They are events that have already occurred in real data center markets in the current moment. And because data centers now serve as the operational backbone of systems that were previously distributed across many different types of infrastructure, a disruption to the power systems feeding them carries consequences that extend far beyond a localized outage. When the servers go dark, it is not just the screens that go dark. The financial algorithms stop running. The hospital scheduling software becomes unavailable. The logistics platforms managing the movement of goods across continental distances lose their operating environment. The translation systems fail. The diagnostic tools that clinicians use to make time-sensitive decisions become inaccessible. The grid that supports AI is not just supporting a technology product. It is supporting the operational reality of a civilization that has reorganized itself around the assumption that these systems will always be available. Research published by Kiteworks and covered by Industrial Cyber in January 2026 identified specific and measurable vulnerabilities that have emerged across the energy and utilities sector as AI has expanded its footprint. Only 9% of energy organizations report conducting AI red teaming, which is the practice of systematically testing critical systems against the kinds of attacks that sophisticated adversaries, including nation-state actors, would actually employ in an operational scenario. 9%. Of an industry responsible for keeping the electricity flowing to every hospital and water treatment plant and emergency communication system in the country. Only 14% of energy organizations maintain AI-specific incident response playbooks, meaning that in the event of an AI-enabled attack on energy infrastructure, 86% of the relevant organizations have no tested plan for what to do. The response would be improvised. And improvised responses to sophisticated, pre-planned attacks are exactly as effective as you would expect them to be. Kiteworks also identified what it called extended incident response dwell times, meaning that attacks on energy systems were going undetected for extended periods before anyone noticed they were occurring. This is not a peripheral concern. Dwell time, the window between when an attacker enters a system and when they are detected and ejected, is one of the most consequential variables in the entire cybersecurity landscape. The longer an attacker remains undetected, the deeper they can move into a system, the more extensively they can map its architecture, the more comprehensively they can establish persistent access points for future operations, and the more damage they can do when they finally choose to act. An attacker who has been quietly present inside a critical infrastructure system for 3 months has had time to understand that system far better than many of the people responsible for operating it. The American Security Project, in analysis published in October 2025, documented the pace at which the cyber threat environment has been accelerating, penetration to attack timelines, the interval between an attacker identifying and exploiting a vulnerability, condensed from 32 days in 2022 to just 5 days in 2025. That is a 6-fold acceleration in the speed of offensive cyber operations in 3 years. The people defending these systems have not gotten 6 times faster at responding. The attackers have gotten 6 times faster at attacking. Weekly cyber attacks targeting US infrastructure increased 56% year over year. Successful exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities increased 34% in the last year recorded. The threat is not holding steady while the defenses improve. The threat is outrunning the defenses. AI is playing a direct role in this acceleration on both sides of the line. Adversaries are using AI tools to automate attacks, to generate more precisely targeted phishing operations, to identify vulnerabilities at a speed no human analyst could match, and to develop self-modifying malware that evolves in response to detection attempts. The American Security Project found that downloads of AI-assisted offensive cyber software exceeded 21.4 million from March to September 2025 alone. Several hundred of the available packages openly advertise that they could be executed against systems not owned by the downloader. The tools of sophisticated cyber attack are no longer the exclusive possession of well-funded nation-state operations. They are available, increasingly, to anyone with a computer and a motive. And the nation-state operations themselves have not been standing still while the tools proliferated downward. China's Volt Typhoon, a state-sponsored threat actor that has been formally attributed by the FBI, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and intelligence partners in multiple allied nations, specifically targeted US energy, transportation, and water sector infrastructure. The stated objective of Volt Typhoon operations, as described in the government's own attribution documents, was not immediate disruption, it was pre-positioning. Establishing persistent access to critical infrastructure systems so that in the event of a geopolitical crisis or military conflict, those systems could be disrupted or disabled with a speed and precision that would otherwise require years of planning. In one documented case that has received less public attention than it deserves, Chinese hackers operated inside the Littleton Electric Light and Water Departments, a utility in Massachusetts, for over 300 days without detection. 300 days. Roughly 10 months of undetected presence inside a utility that is responsible for supplying electricity and water to a populated area. 10 months during which the attackers had access to operational systems, could map infrastructure, could identify vulnerabilities, could establish persistent backdoors, and could do all of this at whatever pace suited their operational requirements, because no one knew they were there. 300 days inside a utility, undetected. That number deserves to be held in mind whenever anyone describes the AI data center security situation as manageable. The Institute for AI Policy and Strategy, in research published in October 2025, noted that no security standard exists specifically for AI data centers, despite their unique vulnerabilities. Not a weak standard, not an outdated standard. No standard at all. The facilities that now constitute critical national infrastructure for AI computation, that house the systems on which financial markets and hospital records and military logistics platforms depend, are being built and operated without a purpose-built security framework designed to address the specific threat environment they face. The Institute called for such a standard to be developed urgently, noting that it is simpler, more cost-effective, and sometimes necessary to implement security features at the outset, rather than retrofitting them after the data centers have been designed and built. Many of the data centers now being built will be operational before any such standard exists. The April 2025 blackout across Spain, Portugal, and parts of France is worth examining here, not because it was caused by a cyber attack, because investigators did not attribute it to one, but because it demonstrated with the clarity that only an actual event can provide what the failure of a modern power grid actually looks like in practice. In what became Europe's largest power system collapse in recent recorded history, an entire G7-level economy was without electricity. Spain's Red Electrica, the national grid operator, described a system completely devoid of energy. Public transportation across the country halted. Bank ATMs went dark across an entire nation simultaneously. Internet connectivity degraded across the region. Hospitals switched to backup generators, consuming diesel fuel reserves that were sized for short-duration outages and not for an event of this duration and geographic scale. The population of an advanced industrial economy discovered, in the space of a few hours, how extensively every dimension of daily life had been reorganized around the assumption of continuous, reliable electrical supply. The blackout was eventually resolved. The lights came back on. The trains began running again. The ATMs were replenished. Spain did not collapse. But Spain's grid operator acknowledged that investigating what happened was a complex technical undertaking, that the cascade of events leading to the failure was not fully understood in real time, and that the vulnerability it exposed required serious attention. The question that critical infrastructure security researchers began asking in the aftermath was a specific and uncomfortable one, not whether a grid failure of this magnitude was possible. April 2025 had just demonstrated that it was, but whether, given the documented persistence of nation-state actors inside energy infrastructure, given the specific prepositioning objectives of operations like Volt Typhoon, and given the now obvious consequences of grid failure at scale, the conditions for an intentionally triggered version of what Spain experienced naturally were already present inside the infrastructure of countries that those actors have publicly identified as adversaries. The Keysight analysis, published in May 2025, observed that the energy grid faces persistent threats from criminal and hostile state actors, including Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, exploiting ransomware, AI-enabled tools, and advanced intrusion capabilities. Volt Typhoon targeted energy, transportation, and water sectors in the US and Canada, with campaigns affecting electricity power generation, transmission, and distribution. Cyber Army of Russia, Reborn, confirmed attacks on US water and energy facilities. Hunt 3R Kill 3Rs targeted Internet-exposed operational technology devices in the US, Europe, and Israel. These are not isolated incidents or the work of opportunistic criminals looking for a payday. They are documented operations conducted by state-level actors pursuing strategic objectives that have been articulated with some clarity, to develop the capability to disrupt US critical infrastructure at a moment of their choosing, in the service of geopolitical objectives that have not become less acute over the period during which AI data center construction has been accelerating. And the AI data center boom has done something specific to the threat environment that makes it qualitatively different from what preceded it. It has concentrated an enormous amount of critical function into a relatively small number of highly interdependent facilities. The more central AI becomes to the operation of financial markets and health systems and logistics networks and military infrastructure, the more damaging a successful attack on the electrical systems feeding AI data centers becomes. The value of the target increases in proportion to the dependency on the target, and dependency on AI infrastructure has been growing at 12% per year for the last 5 years. The security architecture surrounding that infrastructure has not been growing at 12% per year. The red teaming programs and incident response playbooks and monitoring systems and the fundamental security standards have not kept pace with the construction. The gap between what the threat environment requires and what the current security posture delivers is widening. And widening gaps, in security as in engineering, have a way of resolving themselves eventually. The only question is whether they resolve through deliberate intervention or through the kind of event that makes deliberate intervention seem, in retrospect, overdue. Part 3. The water nobody sees. There is a dimension of this crisis that receives almost no coverage relative to its actual scale. Not because the information is classified or hidden inside reports that require security clearance to access. The numbers are publicly available, thoroughly documented, and in some cases quite startling. The dimension receives inadequate attention because it falls into a category of slow, invisible accumulation, the kind of problem that does not announce itself with a blackout or a headline or a market disruption, the kind of problem that grows quietly in the background while attention is directed elsewhere, and that only becomes visible when it has grown large enough to create friction against other systems that people care about more immediately. The problem is water. Data centers run hot. This is not a minor operational detail. It is a fundamental physical reality of the technology. The servers and chips inside a modern AI data center generate enormous quantities of heat as an unavoidable byproduct of computation. The physics of semiconductor operation at the power densities required for AI workloads produce heat at rates that are difficult to convey without comparison. A single rack of high-performance AI computing equipment, the kind installed in hyperscale data centers today, can generate as much heat as a small house. Rows of those racks, in a facility containing thousands of them, generate heat on a scale that requires industrial-grade thermal management systems operating continuously to prevent equipment damage and ensure reliable operation. Managing that heat requires cooling, and cooling, at the scale of a modern AI hyperscaler, requires water, not incidentally, not marginally, substantially and continuously. Microsoft's global water use increased by 34% during the period when it was developing its initial large-scale AI tools. A single data center cluster in Iowa used 6% of the entire local district's water supply in a single month during the training of OpenAI's GPT-4. Not 6% of the district's industrial water allocation. Not 6% of some discretionary commercial category. 6% of everything combined across residential, agricultural, commercial and industrial use. Drawn from the same supply that residents rely on for drinking water, that farmers rely on for irrigation, that local businesses rely on for daily operations. One data center cluster. 1 month. 6% of everything available. Food and Water Watch, in analysis published in October 2025, projected that by 2028, AI-supporting data centers across the United States could consume 720 billion gallons of water annually simply to cool their facilities. 720 billion gallons is an amount that requires translation to be meaningful. It is equal to more than 1 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. It is enough water to meet the indoor needs of 18.5 million American households every year, not as a peak demand scenario, as the baseline operational reality of an AI data center fleet operating at projected scale. And the water being consumed is not grey water, or recycled industrial water, or surface water, drawn from rivers and reservoirs where a certain degree of contamination is tolerable. Data centers require fresh mains water, the same water supply that flows through household taps, because surface water contains contaminants that would clog and corrode the pipes, pumps, and heat exchangers used in cooling systems. The water that keeps AI servers from overheating is chemically indistinguishable from the water that comes out of a kitchen faucet. It competes with household consumption directly, at the level of the same infrastructure, drawing from the same finite supply. Research published in Nature Sustainability in November 2025, based on projections modeling AI data center growth under current trajectories, estimated that by 2030, AI data centers in the United States alone could consume between 731 and 1,125 million cubic meters of water per year. These are not worst-case catastrophe scenarios designed to alarm readers. They are the baseline projections, the numbers that emerge from taking current growth rates and current facility designs and projecting them forward without assuming either extraordinary improvement in efficiency or extraordinary disruption in build-out pace. In states where water is already a contested resource, these projections are not abstractions for future policymakers to worry about. They are immediate practical constraints on development plans that are already underway. In New Mexico, the massive Stargate project, the OpenAI and Oracle data center campus known as Project Jupiter, received $165 billion in county bonds for construction, representing one of the largest individual infrastructure investment commitments in the history of that state. The campus is being built in Doña Ana County, in a region where water scarcity is not a theoretical future concern or a long-range planning assumption. It is a present operational reality. The New Mexico Environment Department is currently evaluating 2 air quality permits for on-site natural gas generating stations proposed by the project's developers. Those generating stations would themselves require water for operation. The data centers themselves would require water for cooling. The region's existing water systems were not designed to absorb both demands simultaneously. In Iowa, where one data center cluster used 6% of a district's entire water supply in a single month, the conversation about what that precedent means for future development has barely begun. In Virginia, which hosts more data center square footage than any other state in the nation, and where data centers consumed approximately 26% of the state's total electricity supply as of 2023, the water consumption implications of continued expansion are just beginning to enter regulatory discussions that have, until now, focused almost entirely on electricity. The compound nature of the water problem makes it more difficult to address than the electricity problem in one specific respect. Electricity shortfalls are visible. They produce brownouts, rolling blackouts, price spikes, and reliability warnings that attract immediate attention from utilities, regulators, and the public. Water shortfalls are invisible until they become acute. Groundwater levels decline slowly. River flows diminish gradually. Reservoirs drop over seasons, not hours. The feedback mechanisms that would prompt earlier intervention operate on much longer timescales than the crisis responses that grid reliability events trigger, By the time a regional water system shows visible signs of stress from data center consumption, competing with residential and agricultural use, the infrastructure creating that stress will have been built, financed, contracted, and integrated into the operational plans of companies that have invested billions of dollars in its creation. The political and economic momentum behind that infrastructure will not reverse easily in response to water table measurements that require hydrogeological expertise to interpret. There is also a paradox embedded in the water situation that the reference to electricity generation only partially captures. Data centers consume water for cooling. But the power plants that generate the electricity those data centers consume also use water, in many cases substantial quantities of it. Thermoelectric power generation, whether from natural gas, coal, or nuclear fuel, requires water for cooling purposes. In regions where data centers are being powered by existing fossil fuel generation, the water demand extends through the entire energy supply chain, from the power plant to the transmission line to the data center's own cooling towers. The full water footprint of an AI computation is larger than the footprint of the data center facility alone, and substantially larger than is captured in facility-level reporting. Microsoft's 34% global water use increase during initial AI development was documented during a period when the scale of AI data center deployment was a fraction of what it is in 2025. The pattern of water consumption that produced a 34% global increase at smaller scale will produce a proportionally larger increase as the scale grows by the factors that current capital expenditure commitments imply. Food and Water, Watch's projection of 720 billion gallons annually by 2028, arrives against the backdrop of a water supply system that was designed without any assumption of this kind of demand. Municipal water systems in the United States were planned, permitted, and built to serve populations and industries whose growth was projected using historical trend rates that predate the AI boom. The planning horizons used by water utilities, which operate on infrastructure investment cycles measured in decades, did not include scenarios in which a single category of new industrial demand could add the equivalent of 18.5 million households' worth of water consumption within a few years. The regulatory frameworks governing water use by data centers are inconsistent across states, largely inadequate to the scale of the problem, and in many jurisdictions entirely non-existent. Several states, including California, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Virginia, have considered or passed bills requiring data centers to report their electricity usage. A smaller number have begun considering water use reporting requirements. The gap between what the data requires policymakers to know and what the existing regulatory structure requires data centers to disclose is wide, and it is widening as construction accelerates ahead of regulatory adaptation. In Arizona, a bill was considered in the state legislature that would have prohibited counties from regulating nuclear reactors located on-site with data centers. The bill's intent was to streamline the permitting of on-site nuclear power generation as a solution to electricity supply constraints. But nuclear power generation also requires cooling water. In Arizona, a state facing chronic water supply challenges in a geography that receives limited annual precipitation and relies heavily on the Colorado River system, which is itself under sustained pressure from drought and overallocation. Adding nuclear-cooled AI data centers to the water demand picture represents a compounding of resource pressures that the existing water governance framework was not built to manage. What makes the water dimension of this crisis particularly significant is its relationship to the electricity dimension. The two problems are not independent. They share infrastructure, they share geography, and they share the same fundamental dynamic: demand growing faster than the systems built to supply it can adapt. In the regions most attractive to data center development, because of available land, favorable climate, existing fiber infrastructure, and tax incentive environments, the combination of electricity and water demands is arriving simultaneously, competing for finite resources that were never sized to absorb them both. The 720 billion gallon figure and the 6 gigawatt PJM shortfall figure and the 5,000 plus data center count are all expressions of the same underlying dynamic. A technology of extraordinary capability and genuine economic value is being built at a pace that has outrun the infrastructure designed to support it, and the resource systems being strained, electricity and water, are not the kind of systems that can be upgraded in a year or two. They are the kind of systems that take decades to develop and that, once stressed beyond certain thresholds, do not recover quickly even with substantial investment. The researcher who studies water systems uses a concept called stressed aquifer recovery time, the number of years required for a groundwater system to return to its pre-depletion level after the stressor is removed. In many aquifer systems, that recovery time is measured in decades. In some, it approaches or exceeds a century. The relationship between the pace of AI data center water consumption and the pace at which impacted water systems can recover suggests that some of the decisions being made today about where to locate data centers and how much water they will use are not reversible on any timescale that is relevant to the communities affected. That is the kind of consideration that rarely surfaces in the conversations that drive capital allocation decisions. It should. Part 4. The dependency loop nobody planned for. Something specific happens when you step back from the individual components of what has been described, the grid shortfall, the security exposure, the water competition, and attempt to view the full picture as a single coherent system rather than as three separate problems occurring in parallel. What you see is not a collection of independent challenges, each with its own causes and its own solutions and its own trajectory. What you see is a dependency loop, a closed circuit of mutual reinforcement in which each element of the system makes the others more necessary, more vulnerable, and more difficult to exit. The loop works as follows, and following it requires patience, because each step is individually logical, and yet the cumulative result of following it all the way around is something that the individual steps taken separately do not obviously suggest. AI requires computation. Computation at scale requires data centers. Data centers require electricity in quantities that the existing grid was not built to supply. The shortfall of electricity supply relative to demand creates pressure on utility companies and policymakers to bring new generation online as quickly as possible. The fastest available path to new generation, given the construction timelines of various power sources, often runs through existing fossil fuel infrastructure, specifically gas plants and, in some cases, coal plants that were slated for retirement. Data centers needing electricity today cannot wait for nuclear plants that will not be operational until the early 2030s, or transmission upgrades that require a decade of permitting and construction. And so in Utah, lawmakers rolled back investments in renewable energy and extended the operational lives of coal plants that were scheduled for decommissioning, because data centers needed power that renewables on current timelines could not provide. In Arizona, the legislature considered legislation that would have prohibited counties from regulating nuclear reactors located on site with data centers, streamlining the path to a power source that is zero carbon, but that requires a decade to build and that also consumes cooling water. At the federal level, Energy Secretary Chris Wright directed federal regulators in October 2025 to develop rules allowing data centers to connect to the grid sooner if they agree to be flexible in their power use, an explicit acknowledgement that the standard interconnection process is too slow to accommodate the pace of data center construction without creating reliability risks. These are rational individual responses to immediate pressures. A utility company facing a data center customer willing to sign a long-term power purchase agreement needs to find generation capacity. A state government competing with other states to attract data center investment offers the permitting environment that closes the deal. A federal energy secretary facing both grid reliability concerns and pressure to maintain American AI competitiveness makes a regulatory decision that prioritizes connection speed over the longer deliberation that standard processes would require. Each decision, made by someone with real responsibilities and real constraints, follows logically from the situation they face. The cumulative effect of those individually rational decisions is a dependency structure that has not been consciously designed by anyone, and that, viewed whole, has properties that none of the individual decision-makers fully intended. The fossil fuel plants being kept alive to power data centers are the same plants whose retirement had been factored into long-range emissions reduction plans. The nuclear plants being fast-tracked for co-location with data centers are adding water demand in regions where water is already contested. The interconnection rules being modified to allow faster data center connections are creating grid integration challenges that the Deloitte survey documented as the leading obstacle to data center infrastructure development. and the AI systems being built on top of all of this are themselves being deployed to manage and optimize elements of the energy grid, creating a situation in which the stability of the grid is increasingly dependent on AI systems, whose operation requires the grid to be stable. That last element is not a theoretical future concern. It is an operational reality that is already present. Google, in April 2025, announced the deployment of AI systems to speed up interconnection processes at PJM, the very grid operator facing a 6 gigawatt reliability shortfall. AI is being used to manage the grid crisis that AI created. The grid depends on AI. AI depends on the grid. The loop is closed. Deloitte's 2025 survey projected US data center power capacity growing from 33 gigawatts in 2024 to 41 gigawatts by the end of 2025, reaching 120 gigawatts by 2030, and continuing to 176 gigawatts by 2035. The capital spending required to build this capacity is staggering. Morgan Stanley estimated that approximately $2.2 trillion will be spent on data centers supporting AI between 2025 and 2029. That is the GDP of a large country invested in a single category of infrastructure over 5 years, and it will be invested whether or not the electricity systems feeding that infrastructure have resolved their reliability challenges, because the economic and competitive pressures driving the investment do not pause to wait for grid upgrades. Amazon's CEO Andy Jassy noted that AWS's AI-related revenue is already a multi-billion-dollar business growing at triple-digit year-over-year rates. When revenue is growing that fast, the competitive pressure to invest in the capacity to capture more of it is nearly irresistible. Every quarter in which a competitor builds more data center capacity than you build is a quarter in which the competitive gap potentially widens. The logic of competition in a high-growth market does not naturally incorporate the externalities being imposed on electrical grids and water systems and security infrastructure by the aggregate of all those individually rational investment decisions. There is also a geopolitical dimension to the dependency loop that deserves attention. The United States has explicitly identified leadership in artificial intelligence as a matter of national security and economic competitiveness. The AI Action Plan, released by the Trump administration in 2025, outlined priorities for advancing AI infrastructure, and energy supply for that infrastructure featured prominently. The framing across administrations and across parties has been consistent. The country that leads in AI leads in the technology that will define the next era of economic and military power. That framing creates a political environment in which constraints on AI data center development, whether from electricity shortfalls or water competition or security concerns, are experienced not as ordinary infrastructure management challenges, but as threats to national competitiveness that must be overcome rather than accommodated. The Institute for Technology and Innovation Policy at ITIF noted in November 2025 that American Electric Power, one of the largest utilities in the country, expects that 3/4 of its demand growth will come from data centers. 3/4. If data center demand does not materialize as expected, the utility's growth projections are wrong in one direction. If it materializes as expected, and the generation capacity is not available to meet it, the utility's reliability projections are wrong in the other direction. The planning system is caught between two scenarios, each of which produces serious problems, and both of which are possible. The congressional response to this situation produced, according to reporting by Canary Media in December 2025, 238 bills related to data centers in state legislatures across the country in 2025 alone. Half of that legislation was specifically dedicated to energy concerns. That volume of legislative activity reflects genuine alarm in the political system about what is happening, but the legislative response is, by its nature, fragmented. 50 states passing 238 bills do not produce a coherent national framework for managing the relationship between AI data center growth and grid reliability. They produce a patchwork of varying requirements, inconsistent reporting obligations, and regulatory environments that data center developers navigate by locating facilities in jurisdictions that offer the most permissive conditions. One idea that gained particular traction in 2025, according to Canary Media, was requiring data centers to agree to reduce their grid consumption during periods of very high demand as a condition of receiving new interconnection approval, The mechanism would involve data centers either reducing computation temporarily, which some workloads can tolerate without significant impact, or using on-site generators and battery storage to supply their own needs during grid peaks, taking themselves off the shared system when it is most stressed. Energy Secretary Wright's October 2025 directive to federal regulators pointed in this direction, asking for rules that would allow faster grid connection in exchange for commitments to demand flexibility. The Electric Power Research Institute's DCFlex project, which involves more than 40 organizations including Google, Meta, Microsoft, Duke Energy, and PJM itself, has been testing exactly this kind of demand response approach in real operational environments. The project's findings suggest that 10 to 40% load modulation, meaning a data center reducing its grid consumption by 10 to 40%, is feasible without breaching service-level agreements with customers. Meta and Microsoft have both piloted programs to dispatch their uninterruptible power supply battery systems into demand response markets, using the batteries that normally serve as backup power during outages as grid resources during peak demand periods. Amazon Web Services has experimented with pre-cooling its Virginia data centers in advance of peak demand periods and then reducing active cooling temporarily, using the thermal mass of the facility itself as a buffer. These are technically interesting and genuinely promising approaches. They represent the kind of creative adaptation that complex systems produce when they are under pressure. And they are, simultaneously, partial responses to a structural imbalance that they cannot fully correct. A data center that reduces its consumption by 30% during peak demand periods is still consuming 70% of its normal load during those same periods. At the scale of current and projected data center deployment, even substantial demand flexibility improvements cannot eliminate the fundamental gap between what the grid was built to supply and what AI infrastructure requires it to supply. The nuclear power revival is perhaps the most dramatic expression of how deep the dependency loop runs. Nuclear power has not been a growth industry in the United States for decades. New nuclear construction has been limited by high capital costs, long permitting timelines, public concern, and the availability of cheaper alternatives. But the combination of AI's need for 24-hour reliable power that is not dependent on weather conditions and the pressure to decarbonize the electricity supply has created a political and economic environment in which nuclear is being reconsidered at a pace that would have been difficult to predict 5 years ago. Oracle has announced designs for a data center intended to be powered by 3 small modular reactors. Sam Altman, through his nuclear startup Oklo, has signed power agreements with data center real estate investment trust Equinix. The Department of Energy announced in 2025 a program to streamline approval processes for advanced reactors and small modular reactors, with an explicit goal of having at least 3 reactors achieve criticality by July 4, 2026. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted TerraPower's construction permit application for a small modular reactor in 2025. X-Energy and Dow applied to build an advanced reactor project in Texas. Nuclear power is real energy. It produces reliable baseload generation without carbon emissions. The revival of interest in it, driven substantially by AI data center demand, is not without logic. But the timescales involved illustrate the depth of the problem it is being asked to solve. The DOE's 2025 program aims for reactor criticality by July 2026, which is a highly compressed timeline for nuclear regulation. Large nuclear plants take between 5 and 11 years from groundbreaking to operation. Small modular reactors promise shorter timelines, but remain commercially unproven at scale. The data centers being built today, and the data centers being permitted today, and the data centers being announced today will need power long before any new nuclear generation built in response to their demand becomes available. In the gap between the power that data centers need now and the generation capacity that can be built to supply it on any reasonable construction schedule, something has to fill the space, and what fills the space is what was already there. Existing fossil fuel plants operated longer than planned at higher utilization rates than originally designed. The coal plants in Utah extended past their retirement dates. The gas plants contracted in regions that cannot build new baseload generation quickly. The existing nuclear fleet, which is being retained and extended in operating license duration, precisely because it represents reliable carbon-free generation that took decades to build and cannot be replaced quickly. The dependency loop runs through all of it. AI needs the grid. The grid needs generation capacity. The fastest available generation capacity runs through fossil fuels. Fossil fuels create the emissions pressure that pushes toward nuclear. Nuclear takes a decade to build. In the interim, fossil fuels. And all of it, every layer of this system is more vulnerable to disruption than the systems that preceded it, because all of it is more concentrated, more interconnected, and more thoroughly dependent on the continuity of digital infrastructure than the electrical grid of 20 years ago was. It was not designed this way. It accumulated this way. Through the aggregation of individually rational decisions made by utilities and regulators and corporations and policymakers, each responding to their immediate circumstances without a complete view of what the aggregate was becoming. And what the aggregate has become is a system in which the continuation of the civilization-scale benefits of AI depends on the uninterrupted operation of a power grid that is simultaneously strained beyond its designed parameters, inadequately secured against documented nation-state threats, and competing with residential and agricultural users for water supplies that were never sized to serve it. That is not a crisis that any single actor created, and it will not be a crisis that any single actor can resolve. Part 5. The pattern behind the pattern. Here is what makes this particular moment more than just a difficult infrastructure story, more than an unfortunate collision of demand projections and supply constraints, more than a regulatory gap waiting to be filled by the next round of congressional legislation. Here is what elevates it beyond the category of problems that have been seen before and addressed before, if imperfectly and slowly, and places it in a category that requires a different frame. The AI power grid crisis is not anomalous. It is symptomatic. It is the visible expression of a pattern that runs through every major technological transition of the modern era. A pattern that has specific and predictable characteristics, and that in the current case is operating at a scale and speed that makes those characteristics more consequential than they have typically been. The pattern is this: transformative technology is adopted faster than the infrastructure designed to support it can adapt, and the gap between adoption speed and infrastructure adaptation creates conditions of systemic stress that produce cascading consequences which were individually predictable, but collectively unanticipated. This pattern has precedents. It played out with electrification itself in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the rapid deployment of electrical appliances and electric motors in homes and factories outpaced the ability of the early grid to supply reliable power, creating conditions of frequent outages, voltage fluctuations, and infrastructure failures that plagued early electrical consumers for decades. It played out with the automobile, which was adopted at a pace that outran road infrastructure, fuel distribution networks, safety regulations, and urban planning frameworks for the better part of half a century. It played out with the internet, where the rapid growth of connected infrastructure through the 1990s and early 2000s created cybersecurity vulnerabilities that governments and corporations are still addressing decades later. In each case, the technology was genuinely transformative. In each case, the adoption curve outran the supporting infrastructure. And in each case, the period of stress between adoption and infrastructure adaptation was characterized by a combination of significant benefits for those positioned to capture them and significant costs distributed across the broader population and the systems that population depends upon. The AI case has features that distinguish it from these historical precedents in ways that make the stakes higher and the adaptation challenge more acute. The first distinguishing feature is speed. The automobile took decades to reach mass adoption from the point of invention. The internet took roughly 15 years to transition from research network to mass consumer technology. The AI transition, measured from the public release of large language models to the point where AI infrastructure is materially stressing the electrical grid, has taken fewer than 5 years. The compression of the adoption timeline is itself a product of AI and of the network effects inherent in software-based technologies and of the enormous capital available to the companies driving deployment. But the compression means that the infrastructure systems that would normally have years or decades to begin adapting have months. Grid planning cycles in the United States typically operate on horizons of 5 to 10 years. Transmission line permitting and construction can take a decade or more. Nuclear power plant construction, as noted, takes 5 to 11 years from groundbreaking to first power. Water infrastructure investment decisions are made on 40-year planning horizons. All of these systems are being asked to respond to a demand signal that materialized in 2 to 3 years. Their structural incapacity to respond at that speed is not a failure of the people running them. It is a geometric mismatch between the timescale of AI adoption and the timescale on which large physical infrastructure systems can change. The second distinguishing feature is concentration. Earlier technological transitions distributed their infrastructure demand across broad geographies and diverse industries. The automobile created demand for roads, fuel, and manufacturing capacity spread across the continental United States and eventually the world. The internet created demand for telecommunications infrastructure distributed across every city and town and suburb that wanted connectivity. AI data center infrastructure, by contrast, is highly geographically concentrated. As of 2023, data centers consumed 26% of Virginia's total electricity supply, 15% of North Dakota's, 12% of Nebraska's, 11% each of Iowa's and Oregon's. These concentrations create grid stress that is local in geography and acute in character, falling heavily on specific utility service territories, specific transmission corridors, and specific water systems, rather than being distributed broadly enough for the existing infrastructure to absorb it without visible strain. The third distinguishing feature, and the one that has received the least adequate attention, is the criticality of the infrastructure being strained. When the automobile outran road infrastructure, the consequence was traffic congestion and road deterioration, significant and costly, but recoverable. When AI data centers outrun electrical infrastructure, the consequence is potential disruption to systems that hospital and emergency services and financial markets and military logistics platforms depend upon for continuous operation. The stakes of failure are not comparable. The electrical grid is what infrastructure theorists call critical infrastructure, systems whose disruption would have debilitating effects on national security, economic security, and public health and safety. Straining a system in that category carries consequences that straining a road network does not. The National Center for Energy Analytics, in November 2025, observed that over the past 60 years, only 26 facilities individually greater than 300 megawatts had been added to the nation's grids, and 20 of those were pumped storage hydroelectric plants. The remaining 6 were conventional large-scale generation. In other words, the American electrical system was built for a world in which truly massive individual loads were extraordinarily rare. Now it's being asked to accommodate more than 1,000 pre-operational data center facilities expected to come online in the next 5 years, with aggregate new demand of approximately 75 gigawatts. 75 gigawatts is larger than the entire electricity generating capacity of many countries. The history of the American electrical system is a history of incremental expansion, of capacity being added in response to demand that grew slowly enough for the planning and permitting and construction process to stay roughly current. The fundamental design assumptions of the system, the planning margins, the reserve capacity requirements, the interconnection protocols, all of these were established in a world where no planner anticipated having to absorb 75 gigawatts of new demand in 5 years from a single industry category. And beneath this infrastructure reality runs something that the data alone cannot fully capture. A cultural and institutional assumption about what the power grid is. It is a utility. It is infrastructure that exists in the background of daily life, that powers the devices and systems that people use without thinking about where the power comes from. It is so fundamental to the organization of modern society that its absence is almost incomprehensible to most people in the developed world, in the way that the absence of oxygen would be incomprehensible to someone who has never experienced altitude sickness. The grid is always there, until it isn't. And the conditions under which it might not be there have been multiplying faster than public awareness of them has grown. The 6 gigawatt shortfall projected for PJM by 2027 represents one measurable indicator of a structural imbalance that extends beyond any single grid operator. PJM serves 65 million people and is the largest single electricity market in the world, but it's not the only grid region under pressure. The Electric Power Research Institute projects that US data centers may see electricity consumption more than double by 2030, accounting for 9% of the country's total electricity demand. Goldman Sachs estimated global data center power usage at 55 gigawatts in early 2025 and projected it to reach 122 gigawatts by 2030. The gap between what exists and what is needed is not a feature unique to PJM. It is a national and increasingly global characteristic of the relationship between AI infrastructure demand and electricity supply capacity. The security layer compounds this pattern in a specific way. Infrastructure systems under stress, systems operating closer to their design limits than normal, systems being pushed to accommodate loads they were not built for, are more vulnerable to disruption than systems operating comfortably within their design parameters. A grid running at higher utilization rates has less reserve margin to absorb unexpected events. A grid with more complex interconnections and more digital control systems has more potential entry points for adversaries seeking access. A security team stretched thin, managing rapid interconnection of new loads has less capacity to monitor for intrusion and respond to threats that are simultaneously becoming faster and more sophisticated. The documented acceleration of offensive cyber capabilities from the 32-day penetration to attack window in 2022 to the 5-day window in 2025 is occurring in parallel with the acceleration of data center construction and the associated grid stress. These are not coincidental. They are related expressions of the same underlying dynamic. The technology environment is moving faster in every direction simultaneously. AI is enabling faster and more capable offensive cyber operations at the same moment that AI data centers are creating a larger, more concentrated, more critical target for those operations. The attack surface is expanding while the attack capability is improving, and while the defensive posture, measured by the 9% AI red teaming rate and the 14% incident response playbook coverage, is lagging behind both. The question that emerges from this pattern, the question that serious analysts in the intelligence community and the infrastructure security community and the energy policy community are beginning to ask more openly than they did even 2 or 3 years ago, is whether the convergence of these trends, the grid stress, the security exposure, the water competition, the dependency loop, and the documented interest of adversarial state actors in positioning themselves inside US critical infrastructure has crossed from the category of manageable infrastructure challenge into the category of genuine systemic risk. The answer, offered carefully and with the appropriate acknowledgement that the situation is dynamic and that assessments made today may look different in a year, is that the conditions for systemic risk are present. Not that systemic failure is certain or even necessarily likely in the near term, but that the conditions under which it could occur are not hypothetical. They are documented, they are measurable, and they are growing more pronounced rather than less pronounced as data center construction continues to accelerate and infrastructure adaptation continues to lag behind it. The honest version of this assessment does not come with a clean resolution or a definitive prediction. The systems involved are too complex and the number of variables too large for that kind of precision. What it comes with is a recognition that the current trajectory has specific and identifiable risks, that those risks are not being priced into the capital allocation decisions driving data center expansion, that the regulatory frameworks governing the systems being strained are not keeping pace with the stressors, and that the adversaries paying the closest attention to this situation have both the capability and the stated strategic interest to exploit exactly the kind of concentrated vulnerability that the current moment represents. Knowing that does not determine what happens next, but not knowing it, or knowing it, and treating it as someone else's problem to solve, has consequences that extend well beyond the electricity bills of the people living near data centers and well beyond the operational concerns of the utility companies managing grid reliability margins. It extends to every system, every hospital, every emergency service, every financial institution, every military capability that depends on the continuous operation of the electrical infrastructure that AI has made more important and simultaneously more stressed than it has ever been. That is the pattern behind the pattern, and the pattern is not hidden. It is written in the capital expenditure reports of the largest companies in the world, in the grid reliability projections of PJM, in the red teaming statistics of the energy sector, in the water consumption numbers of Iowa counties and New Mexico aquifer systems. It is available to anyone who reads far enough past the press releases. The question is whether that reading produces the kind of response the situation calls for, and on a timeline that matters. Part 6. What comes next? Now we come to the part that actually determines outcomes. Not the models and the projections and the historical patterns and the threat assessments, As necessary as all of those are for understanding the situation accurately, the part that determines outcomes is what happens next. And what happens next depends not on whether the problem is real, which the evidence has established beyond any reasonable dispute, but on whether the response to it is adequate, and adequate on a timeline that matters. The path forward is not unknown. It is not hidden inside classified briefings or academic literature too technical for anyone without a graduate degree to engage with. It is visible, and it is real, and it is also genuinely hard, in the specific sense that hard things are hard because they require coordination among people and institutions with different interests and different timescales, and different accountability structures, not because the technical requirements are beyond human capability. Start with electricity, because that is the most immediate and most measurable constraint. The Electric Power Research Institute's DCFlex project represents the clearest operational framework for managing data center electricity demand in a way that serves both the data center and the grid. The project involves more than 40 organizations, including Google, Meta, Microsoft, Duke Energy, and PJM Interconnection, testing in real operational environments the proposition that data centers can be managed as flexible grid resources rather than fixed constant loads. The findings, published in 2025, indicate that 10 to 40% load modulation is achievable at hyperscale data centers without breaching service-level agreements. Meta and Microsoft have piloted dispatch of their uninterruptible power supply battery systems into demand response markets. Amazon Web Services has tested pre-cooling strategies that use the thermal mass of data center facilities as a buffer against peak demand periods. These are not theoretical demonstrations. They are operational results from real facilities at real scale. If adopted broadly across the data center industry, flexible demand management of this kind would meaningfully reduce the peak demand that grid operators must plan for, potentially reducing the gap between required reliability margins and available supply without requiring equivalent investment in new permanent generation capacity. Regulators at both the federal and state level are developing frameworks to make this kind of flexibility standard rather than voluntary, and the direction of that regulatory evolution appears clear, even if the specific rules are still being written. The Institute for Technology and Innovation Policy, in November 2025, outlined 3 priorities identified by the Department of Energy's 2024 recommendations on AI and data center infrastructure: improving efficiency in AI workloads, codifying utility operator flexibility contracts, and accelerating clean generation and storage tailored for data center load growth. The first of these is worth dwelling on, because it receives less attention than the supply-side responses and has significant potential. AI workload efficiency is not fixed. The computational intensity of AI inference, which is the process of using a trained model to generate outputs in response to queries, has been declining as researchers develop more efficient architectures, better hardware-software co-design, and more sophisticated approaches to model compression and quantization. The energy required per inference has been falling, even as the number of inferences being performed has been rising explosively, which is why the net energy consumption has been growing rather than falling. But the efficiency trajectory is real, and investments in improving it can reduce the electricity demand per unit of AI output. The broader deployment of energy-efficient chip architectures, better cooling technologies, and improved workload scheduling that concentrates computation during off-peak hours all contribute to reducing the grid stress that any given level of AI usage creates. Large technology companies have invested substantially in these efficiency improvements, partly because electricity is a major operational cost, and partly because regulatory pressure and public scrutiny of AI's environmental footprint has created reputational incentives for visible improvement. The question is whether efficiency gains can keep pace with the growth in AI usage. Historical experience suggests they cannot fully offset it, but they can substantially slow the rate at which the gap between demand and supply widens. On the security side, the path forward is similarly visible if similarly difficult to travel. The Institute for AI Policy and Strategy has called for the development of an AI data center security standard, the first security framework designed specifically for the unique vulnerabilities of facilities that house frontier AI systems. The Institute recommends a phased approach, beginning with a baseline of current best practices before advancing to levels sufficient to address nation-state threat actors, Such a standard would serve multiple purposes simultaneously, providing regulators with a basis for procurement and export requirements, giving companies a credible way to signal security posture to investors and insurers, and creating the kind of accountability structure that, in other critical infrastructure sectors, has driven consistent improvement in baseline security practices. The current situation, in which only 9% of energy organizations conduct AI red teaming and only 14% maintain AI-specific incident response playbooks, reflects in part the absence of any requirement to do so. Organizations respond to mandates. When the requirement does not exist, the investment required to meet it tends not to be made, because security investment that addresses hypothetical future threats competes for budget against operational requirements with immediate and measurable returns. A clear standard changes the cost-benefit calculation by making compliance a requirement rather than a choice. The federal regulatory landscape is moving in this direction, though more slowly than the threat environment requires. FERC and NERC have been updating their cybersecurity requirements for power companies under frameworks including NERC CIE 0039, which imposes stricter requirements for internal network security monitoring and remote access. FERC Order 887 adds requirements in the same domain. These updates are being driven by awareness of exactly the threat environment described in this discussion: the documented penetration of energy infrastructure by Volt Typhoon and other state-sponsored actors, and the acceleration of offensive cyber capabilities that has reduced attack timelines from weeks to days. But regulatory updates to existing frameworks, important as they are, do not fully address the specific characteristics of AI data center security. AI data centers are not just larger versions of conventional data centers. They involve hardware supply chains with specific vulnerabilities, chip architectures with side-channel attack surfaces that conventional IT security frameworks were not designed to address, and interconnections between IT and operational technology systems that create attack pathways that did not exist in earlier generations of infrastructure. The security standard specifically designed for AI data centers does not yet exist. The call for it to be developed is not premature. On the water question, the path forward requires something that has been largely absent from the conversation so far: mandatory disclosure. The current situation, in which data centers are required in many jurisdictions to report their electricity consumption, but are not required to report water consumption, produces a planning environment in which utilities and water managers and the communities they serve cannot fully account for the resource demands being placed on shared infrastructure. You cannot manage what you cannot measure, and you cannot measure what you are not required to report. Several states, California, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Virginia among them, have moved toward requiring or incentivizing water use reporting from data centers, but the absence of a federal reporting standard means that the patchwork of state requirements produces incomplete national data and creates regulatory arbitrage opportunities where data center developers locate in jurisdictions with weaker reporting requirements. A national water use disclosure standard for large data centers, aligned with the electricity reporting frameworks already under development in several states, would provide the baseline information necessary for regional water managers to incorporate data center demand into long-range water planning. The nuclear question sits at the intersection of all three resource challenges. Small modular reactors, if they can be built at the cost and speed their proponents project, would provide zero-carbon electricity without the intermittency of solar and wind, reducing the grid reliability problem and the carbon emissions problem simultaneously. Several designs consume less water than conventional thermoelectric generation, and the concentration of nuclear generation co-located with data centers would reduce the transmission infrastructure required to connect new generation to new demand. The DOE's 2025 program to accelerate small modular reactor deployment, with an explicit goal of criticality by July 4, 2026, for at least 3 reactors, represents the kind of focused federal action that could meaningfully shift the nuclear timeline. Ontario Power Generation received construction approval for a GE Hitachi BWRX-300 reactor at the Darlington site in April 2025, providing a concrete international precedent for the construction and regulatory approval process at the pace the situation requires. But the honest assessment of nuclear's role in the near-term electricity supply problem is that it is a solution for the 2030s rather than the 2020s. The data center power needs of the next 3 to 5 years will be met from the generation sources that already exist or that can be built on the timescales relevant to that window. That means renewables, increasingly, because they can be deployed faster than any other generation type, but also means continued reliance on gas and coal, where renewables cannot provide the reliability that data centers require. The renewable share is growing, accounting for approximately 92% of all planned generating capacity additions to the grid in 2025 according to the ITIF analysis, but the electricity value of solar capacity must be adjusted for the fact that solar produces nothing for roughly 75% of the hours in a year. Intermittent generation cannot, on its own, serve the 24-hour-a-day demand of AI data centers without storage or backup that provides reliable output when the sun is not shining. The political dimension of what comes next is not separable from the technical and regulatory dimensions, because the decisions that will determine the outcome are made by people operating in political environments with competing interests and finite attention and constituencies whose immediate concerns often differ from the long-range concerns that infrastructure planning requires. Rob Gramlich, president of power consulting firm Grid Strategies, told CNBC that he expects the debate over data centers to become even more intense in the coming years as Americans begin to experience the utility bill increases that current trends suggest are coming. "I don't think we've seen the end of the political repercussions," he said. "Every politician will claim to have the answer to affordability, while accusing opponents of policies that would raise rates further. The political pressure created by visible consumer electricity cost increases is likely to be more effective than abstract infrastructure reliability concerns at motivating the kind of sustained policy attention that the situation requires." This is not cynicism. It is an accurate description of how democratic political systems respond to problems, which is typically in response to consequences that are experienced by voters rather than in anticipation of consequences that are modeled by analysts. The tension between the pace of AI development and the pace of the political and regulatory response is itself one of the defining features of this moment. AI capabilities are advancing on a timeline measured in months. Infrastructure adaptation is advancing on a timeline measured in years. Political and regulatory response is advancing on a timeline measured in electoral cycles and legislative sessions. The asynchrony of these timescales is not a bug to be corrected by better coordination, though better coordination would help. It is a fundamental characteristic of the relationship between fast-moving technology and the slower-moving systems of governance and physical infrastructure that technology operates within. What comes next will be shaped by which of these timescales exerts the most pressure on the others. If infrastructure fails visibly, political attention accelerates. If security incidents involving energy infrastructure occur at a significant scale, regulatory response accelerates. If water competition becomes acute in regions that have both political representation and data center development, water governance frameworks accelerate. The adaptation of systems to demand is not linear. It happens in discontinuities, driven by events that make visible what analysis had previously only described. The analysis has been describing the situation for long enough that the events, when they come, should not be surprising. What will be surprising, as it always is the specific form they take, the specific grid region that fails first, the specific infrastructure sector where a security incident crosses the threshold of visibility, the specific water system where competition becomes acute enough to drive regulatory action. The specifics are not predictable. The general shape of what is coming is for anyone willing to read the pattern carefully not a mystery. The current trajectory does not lead to equilibrium without intervention. Demand continues to grow. Grid capacity continues to lag. Security gaps continue to widen. Water competition continues to intensify. The intervention required is substantial, it is multidimensional, and it requires coordination across sectors and jurisdictions that do not naturally coordinate. None of that makes the intervention impossible. It makes it hard, and hard things that are genuinely necessary have a way of eventually happening, particularly in systems with democratic accountability structures and market mechanisms that ultimately price in the costs that were previously externalized. The question that remains open, and that will be answered by the next several years of events, is whether the intervention happens on a timeline that prevents the most severe consequences of the current trajectory, or on a timeline that follows the consequences closely enough that those consequences become part of the historical record of the AI era, alongside its extraordinary capabilities and its genuine benefits. That question does not have a predetermined answer. The trajectory is not destiny. The systems involved are complex enough and the actors numerous enough, and the available responses real enough, that the outcome remains genuinely contingent on decisions that have not yet been made, which is, ultimately, the only kind of situation in which the awareness of what is happening can do any good. Part 7. The geopolitical stakes. There is a dimension of the AI power grid story that connects the infrastructure question to something larger, something that operates on a scale that individual utility rate cases and grid reliability reports and water use projections do not quite capture. It is the dimension in which the power grid is not simply a technical system that delivers electricity to homes and businesses and data centers, but a strategic asset in a competition between nations that both sides understand to be consequential in ways that go beyond any individual technology cycle. The United States and China are engaged in a competition for leadership in artificial intelligence that both governments have publicly described as a defining priority for the coming decades. The national security strategy of the United States identifies AI as a foundational technology for national power. The Chinese government's strategic frameworks from the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan of 2017 through subsequent policy documents describe AI leadership as central to China's goal of becoming the world's leading power in science and technology by 2030. Both countries are investing at scales that reflect how seriously they take this competition. Both countries are building the infrastructure on which their AI ambitions depend, and both countries are simultaneously studying the infrastructure vulnerabilities of the other. This is not unusual in the history of great power competition. Adversaries have always studied each other's critical infrastructure for strategic vulnerabilities. What is unusual in the current moment is the specific character of the vulnerability being studied and the specific timing of when it has emerged. The vulnerability is dependency. The United States is building AI infrastructure at a pace that is creating a concentrated, critical dependency on electrical systems that are simultaneously being strained beyond their designed parameters. The concentration of AI computation in relatively few geographic clusters, the 35+ gigawatts of new data center capacity expected to come online in the next 5 years, the documented pre-positioning operations of Chinese state-sponsored threat actors inside US energy infrastructure, all of these are not separate phenomena. They are elements of a single strategic picture that is visible to anyone with access to the relevant classified intelligence assessments and the willingness to connect the publicly available dots that point in the same direction. The specific objective of Volt Typhoon operations, as described in the government's own public attribution documents, was pre-positioning, the establishment of persistent access inside critical infrastructure systems that could be activated in the event of a geopolitical crisis or military conflict. The time frame that US defense planners have identified as most critical is the period before and around potential conflict scenarios in the Pacific, specifically scenarios involving Taiwan. The window in which pre-positioned cyber capabilities inside US energy infrastructure would be most strategically valuable is exactly the window during which US AI data center infrastructure is most concentrated, most load-stressed, and least comprehensively secured against the specific threat that pre-positioning represents. This alignment is not coincidence. It is the expression of a strategic logic that operates independently of whether anyone in the US data center industry has consciously contributed to it. The strategic value of disrupting an adversary's AI infrastructure at a critical moment increases as that adversary's dependency on its AI infrastructure increases. Every year of AI adoption that deepens the integration of AI into financial systems, logistics networks, military logistics, and communication infrastructure makes the disruption of the grid that powers that AI more consequential. The value of the pre-positioned access grows as the target it is positioned to disrupt grows more critical. The Belfer Center's February 2026 analysis noted that data center growth in Virginia, the state that hosts more data center square footage than any other in the country, will add thousands of megawatts of nearly constant demand over the next few years. Virginia's proximity to the national capital region and its concentration of government and defense contractor data centers makes it a geography of particular strategic sensitivity. Dominion's 2024 resource plan projects nearly 27 gigawatts of new generation by 2039 in the Virginia service territory, including 21 gigawatts of renewable energy and approximately 6 gigawatts of gas. The build-out required to serve Northern Virginia's data center corridor is, in resource planning terms, the equivalent of building the electricity infrastructure for a new large city in less than a decade. The transmission infrastructure required to deliver that power to Northern Virginia's data center campuses is itself a strategic consideration. Transmission lines are long, linear, difficult to secure, and essential to the delivery of electricity from generation facilities to load centers. The security of transmission infrastructure against physical attack, which is distinct from cyber attack, is an ongoing concern that has surfaced in several documented incidents in the United States in recent years. In December 2023, substations in Moore County, North Carolina were physically attacked, leaving approximately 45,000 customers without power. The attack has not been publicly attributed to a state actor, but it demonstrated the physical vulnerability of the high-voltage infrastructure that serves large load centers. The concentration of AI infrastructure in specific geographic clusters makes the transmission infrastructure serving those clusters a strategic target of unusual value. Disrupting the transmission corridors that deliver power to Northern Virginia's data centers would not merely inconvenience the residents of suburban counties. It would degrade or disable the cloud services that thousands of government agencies, military commands, financial institutions, and critical infrastructure operators depend upon for continuous operation. The relationship between this geopolitical dimension and the domestic infrastructure policy conversation is not adequately reflected in either. The domestic policy conversation treats the AI power grid problem primarily as an infrastructure and regulatory challenge, a question of how to build more generation capacity faster, how to modernize the interconnection process, how to allocate costs fairly between data centers and other ratepayers. The geopolitical conversation treats AI primarily as a capability competition, a question of who trains the most capable models, who deploys them at the widest scale, who captures the most economic value from AI-enabled productivity. What neither conversation adequately incorporates is the relationship between the two. The fact that the infrastructure decisions being made in the domestic policy context have strategic implications in the geopolitical context, and that the strategic competition being conducted in the geopolitical context is being played out partly through the infrastructure that the domestic policy context is responsible for securing. The Institute for AI Policy and Strategy made this connection explicitly in its October 2025 research. Frontier AI systems are developed and deployed using compute clusters of hundreds of thousands of cutting-edge AI chips housed in specialized data centers. These AI data centers are likely tempting targets for sophisticated adversaries like China and Russia, who may seek to steal intellectual property or sabotage AI systems underpinning military, industry, or critical infrastructure projects. The Institute noted that Chinese cyber operations are particularly capable, and that state-sponsored Chinese hacking groups have demonstrated the ability to penetrate critical US networks and infrastructure and remain undetected for months or even years. The energy sector's 9% AI red teaming rate and 14% incident response playbook coverage exist in a world where Chinese state-sponsored actors have demonstrated they can remain undetected inside utility infrastructure for over 300 days. The gap between those two facts is not a gap in a regulatory framework. It is a gap in national security posture. It is the space between what adversaries can do and what defenders have prepared for. And in that space, strategic risk accumulates. The United States is not the only country grappling with this. The European Union's experience with energy security, sharpened by the disruptions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, produced a rapid and thorough revaluation of critical infrastructure vulnerability that has not been matched in the United States at the same speed or the same depth. Europe's AI infrastructure ambitions are substantially smaller than America's, partly because of regulatory constraints, and partly because of capital and talent differences. But the security frameworks Europe is developing for AI infrastructure, in part as an outgrowth of the NS2 directive's expanded critical infrastructure protections, represent a model that the American policy conversation has not yet fully engaged. The geopolitical dimension also shapes the timeline question in ways that the purely domestic policy frame does not capture. Domestic policy timescales are set by legislative sessions and regulatory proceedings and electoral cycles. Geopolitical timescales are set by strategic windows and military planning horizons, and the pace at which adversaries develop and refine their capabilities. If the relevant window for pre-positioned cyber capabilities to be activated is the next 3 to 5 years, then the relevant timeline for closing the security gaps in US AI infrastructure is not the comfortable multi-year regulatory deliberation that infrastructure policy normally operates on. It is a compressed window in which the gap between adversary capability and defensive posture must be narrowed faster than the deliberative processes that govern American infrastructure security typically allow. This does not mean that the normal processes should be abandoned. It means that they should be understood in the context of the strategic environment they are operating in, and that the pace of adaptation should be calibrated to the pace of the threat rather than to the pace of business as usual. The power grid crisis that AI has created is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the relationship between the speed of technological transformation and the speed of the systems designed to govern and support it. The geopolitical dimension adds a layer to that story that changes its character. It is also a story about who benefits from the gap between transformation speed and governance speed, and whether the actors who benefit from that gap include adversaries whose strategic interests are not aligned with the continuity and security of the infrastructure being built. That is the uncomfortable question that sits at the intersection of the infrastructure analysis and the security research and the geopolitical competition. It does not have a comfortable answer. The comfortable version of the story is that these are separate problems that can be addressed separately, on their own timescales, through their own institutional channels. The accurate version is that they are related expressions of a single structural condition, and that the relationship between them is being actively exploited by actors with both the capability and the intention to do so. Knowing this does not determine the outcome. The outcome is still determined by decisions that have not yet been made, but it changes the frame within which those decisions should be understood, from a frame of infrastructure management and regulatory modernization to a frame of strategic consequence. And that change of frame is, in the end, the most important thing this story has to offer. Not alarm, not prediction, but an accurate description of the stakes involved in choices that are being made in many cases without full awareness of those stakes. The grid is a strategic asset. The data centers it powers are strategic assets. The security of both is a strategic imperative, and the current posture does not reflect that imperative with anything approaching the seriousness the situation warrants. Part 8. The human cost. All of the numbers in this story have people behind them. The 6 gigawatt reliability shortfall that appears in a PJM grid study is a number that will, if it materializes without adequate response, be experienced by specific people in specific places during specific events that they were not prepared for. The 720 billion gallons of projected annual water consumption is a number that will, as it accumulates, be experienced by the families in Iowa counties and New Mexico communities and Virginia suburbs who will see their water bills increase, their water pressure drop, and their local water managers face constraints they were not planning for. The 9% red teaming rate is a number that will, if the threat environment produces the kind of event that number suggests is inadequately defended against, be experienced by the people who work in the hospitals and emergency services and financial institutions that depend on the electricity systems that adequate security practices are meant to protect. There are people in the middle of this story who are not abstractions. They are the utility planners at companies like American Electric Power, which has announced that it expects 3/4 of its future demand growth to come from data centers, who are trying to build generation capacity on planning timescales of 5 to 10 years in response to data center growth that is arriving in 2 to 3 years. They are the grid operators at PJM whose job is to maintain reliability across a 13-state system, serving 65 million people, in an environment where their most sophisticated modeling tools are telling them they are headed toward a 6 gigawatt shortfall that has no clean precedent in the organization's history. Ken and Carol Apaki, residents of Central Ohio, where 130 data centers have been built in recent years, spoke to NPR in January 2026 about their electricity bill. It had increased 60%. In 2023, they were paying roughly $12 per 100 kilowatt hours. In 2025, $19. The Apakis had not changed their habits. They were not running more appliances or keeping their home warmer or cooler than they had before. Their bill went up because the transmission infrastructure serving the data center corridor in their region required investment that was distributed across all ratepayers in the service territory. Mark Reiter, who runs their local utility, AEP Ohio, explained it directly. The grid supports everybody. It's almost a universal service, and the costs of expanding and upgrading it for data centers are, under the standard model of utility cost allocation, shared broadly rather than recovered exclusively from the customers creating the demand. The Apaches are one household. The Carnegie Mellon University study that estimated an 8% increase in the average US electricity bill by 2030 from data centers and cryptocurrency mining, potentially exceeding 25% in the highest demand markets of Central and Northern Virginia, represents a trajectory that, if it materializes, will be experienced as real dollars by real households who are not involved in the AI economy in any way that makes the cost increase feel like a fair exchange for a commensurate benefit. In Doña Ana County, New Mexico, the people who attended the September 2025 meeting where commissioners were asked to approve $165 billion in bonds for the Stargate data center campus were not infrastructure analysts or grid reliability specialists or cybersecurity researchers. They were residents of a county in a state where water scarcity is a lived experience rather than a planning assumption, who were looking at a development proposal for a campus that would place enormous additional demand on both the electrical grid and the water systems of their region, and trying to understand whether the economic benefits of hosting that campus would accrue to them in forms that made the resource competition worthwhile. The activists who gathered at that meeting, and the more than 230 national organizations that joined Food and Water Watch in December 2025, calling on Congress to stop all new data centers, are part of the human story too. They are people who have concluded that the pace of data center development has outrun the governance frameworks designed to ensure that local communities bear their costs equitably and have meaningful input into decisions about where large facilities are located and at what scale. Lawmakers across every state considered 238 bills related to data centers in 2025. Behind each of those bills are people, the constituents who called their representatives with concerns about electricity bills or water use, or the planned conversion of agricultural land to server farm campuses, the industry lobbyists making the case for data centers as economic development assets that bring tax revenue and jobs and regional investment, the utility executives trying to explain to legislators why cost allocation works the way it does, and what the alternatives would mean for system reliability and investment incentives, the emergency managers and first responders who work in regions with high concentrations of data centers are part of this story in a way that rarely receives attention. Emergency planning in those regions must now account for the concentrated criticality of the facilities in their jurisdictions. A large data center campus that loses power is not just a business continuity problem for the company that owns it. It is a potential cascade through every system that depends on the cloud services hosted in those facilities. Emergency planners who were previously focused on the kinds of events that produce local emergencies, fires, floods, severe weather, are now operating in an environment where the large facilities in their jurisdictions are both potential emergency sites and nodes in a network whose disruption could produce consequences that extend far beyond the local geography. The people who work inside data centers, the operations teams and the security engineers, and the power systems technicians and the facilities managers are doing jobs that have become genuinely more complex and more consequential in a short period of time. The shift from conventional data centers to AI hyperscalers has changed the technical requirements of these roles significantly. AI workloads run at higher power densities, generate more heat, and place greater demands on the cooling and power distribution systems that these workers maintain. The pace of new facility deployment has created staffing pressures that the industry is managing against a talent market that has not grown as fast as the facilities requiring talent. The utility workers who operate the generation facilities and transmission lines that serve data center loads are navigating a changed operational environment too. The load profiles that AI data centers create are different from the load profiles that utilities built their operational procedures around. 24-hour constant load at very high levels, without the daily and seasonal variation patterns that characterized earlier industrial customers, requires different operational management. The harmonic distortions and load relief warnings that Deloitte documented in leading data center growth regions are real events that utility operations staff encounter and manage. The researchers and analysts who have been measuring what is happening and publishing the numbers that appear throughout this discussion are also people doing a job that matters more than is typically recognized. The IEA analysts who produced the April 2025 Energy and AI report, the Belfer Center researchers who mapped the relationship between data center growth and grid reliability, the Kiteworks security researchers who measured the 9% red teaming rate, the Food and Water Watch team that calculated the 720 billion gallons figure, the Carnegie Mellon team that modelled the electricity bill impact. All of these people spent months working to make visible what was otherwise invisible in the aggregate data. Their work is what makes it possible to have a conversation about this subject at all. And there are the people who will experience the outcomes of the decisions currently being made without being part of the conversations in which those decisions are made. The families in regions where data centers have not yet arrived, but where the investment climate makes their arrival likely. The communities that depend on water systems whose long-range adequacy will be shaped by data center siting decisions made in capital allocation meetings they have no access to. The hospital patients and emergency service recipients who will be affected if the grid reliability shortfalls that analysts are modelling materialise in the forms that models suggest they might. These people are not powerless. The 238 bills introduced in state legislatures in 2025 were introduced because constituents made their concerns legible to legislators. The national moratorium conversation was initiated because organised advocacy groups made the aggregate case that individual communities were making locally. The regulatory proceedings at PJM, at FERC, at state public utility commissions across the country involve comment periods and stakeholder processes precisely because the people affected by infrastructure decisions have, in American regulatory practice, formal opportunities to make their interests known. But participation in regulatory proceedings requires awareness of those proceedings, time to engage with technical material that is not designed for general audiences, and the organizational capacity to translate individual concerns into effective advocacy. All three of these requirements are in short supply in the communities most affected by rapid data center development, which tend to be rural or semi-rural areas with limited institutional resources for engaging complex regulatory processes. The gap between who is affected by the decisions and who participates in the processes that make them is itself a dimension of the human cost of the current trajectory. None of this changes the technical realities of the electricity and water and security picture. The grid shortfall is real whether or not the Apaches in Ohio know why their bill went up. The red teaming gap is real whether or not the emergency managers in Virginia counties have adequate information about the facilities in their jurisdictions. The water demand is real whether or not the residents of Doña Ana County win their advocacy battles in the state legislature. But the human dimension of this story matters for a reason beyond its intrinsic importance. Policy changes when enough people understand enough of the situation to sustain the political will necessary for change. Infrastructure governance evolves when the communities affected by infrastructure decisions have enough information to engage effectively in the processes that make those decisions. Security posture improves when the people responsible for it understand the threat environment clearly enough to make the case for the investment required to address it. The 6 gigawatt number and the 720 billion gallon number and the 9% red teaming number are not ends in themselves. They are means, tools for making visible what would otherwise remain invisible, for enabling the kind of informed engagement that can actually influence outcomes, for translating what the data shows into the kind of practical pressure that changes how decisions are made. The machines are running, the grid is holding, the analysts are measuring, the regulators are deliberating. And somewhere in central Ohio, the Apaches are looking at an electricity bill that is 60% higher than it was 2 years ago, wondering whether the data centers being built nearby are the reason, and whether anyone in a position of authority is thinking about what that means for the next 2 years and the next 10. They are right to wonder, and they are not wrong to expect that the people making the decisions that affect them are thinking about it more carefully and more urgently than the current pace of the response suggests. There is a calculation that runs beneath all of this, invisible in most of the conversations that touch on pieces of it, but present in all of them if you know where to look. It is not a calculation that any single person or organization has made explicitly. It has emerged from the aggregate of millions of individual decisions, each rational in its own frame, each contributing to a collective outcome that no one specifically chose. The calculation is essentially this. The benefits of AI adoption, measured in productivity and competitive advantage and capability and convenience and economic value, have been captured by specific actors, companies and investors and users and the nations whose economies they animate, while the costs of AI adoption, measured in grid stress and water consumption and security vulnerability, and infrastructure strain and rate increases for households have been distributed across a much broader population that did not participate in the decision to impose those costs and is not always aware that the decisions have been made. This is not an unusual arrangement in the history of industrial development. The benefits and costs of industrial transitions have rarely been distributed symmetrically. The people who benefit most from a technology are often not the people who bear the largest costs of its infrastructure requirements. That asymmetry generates political pressure over time, and the political pressure eventually modifies the distribution, sometimes through regulation, sometimes through taxation, sometimes through liability frameworks that make cost imposers internalize a larger share of what they impose. The AI power grid situation is in the early stages of that process. The asymmetry is becoming visible. The 238 bills in state legislatures in 2025, the Senate investigation into whether data centers are driving up electricity bills, the growing resistance from communities being asked to host facilities whose costs they bear while their benefits flow elsewhere. All of these are expressions of the political pressure that asymmetric cost distribution eventually produces. The question is whether that pressure can accumulate into effective policy change faster than the infrastructure stress created by the current distribution accumulates into the kind of events that change the conversation from how to avoid consequences to how to recover from them. That race between the pace of policy adaptation and the pace of infrastructure stress is the underlying dynamic of this moment. It is not a race with a predetermined winner. It is a race whose outcome is determined by how many people understand what is at stake and whether that understanding translates into the kind of sustained attention that meaningful policy change requires. The data centers are being built, the electricity is being consumed, the water is being drawn, the adversaries are pre-positioning, the grid is holding for now within its limits, and the gap between what the current trajectory produces and what the systems supporting it were built to absorb is growing, 1 gigawatt at a time, 1 billion gallons at a time, one undetected intrusion at a time, in the quiet hours when the servers are running and the world that depends on them is asleep. That is where we are, and where we go from here is still, remarkably, a matter of choice. The quiet in the machine. The servers are running right now, somewhere in a building that most people will never see, in a city that most people will never visit, in a facility drawing power from a grid that is carrying more load than it was designed to carry, inside a campus that uses more water in a single month than many rural communities use in a year. Machines are thinking on behalf of a civilization that has decided their thinking is indispensable. They are processing queries and generating responses and running the models that optimize the systems that organize the world that the people living above them depend upon. The financial algorithms that route transactions through markets that never sleep. The logistics platforms that determine which packages move on, which trucks through which distribution centers, so that things ordered in the morning arrive by evening. The diagnostic tools that surface patterns in medical imaging that human eyes miss. The scheduling systems that allocate operating rooms and allocate emergency response resources, and allocate the finite attention of institutions that are themselves increasingly dependent on the machines doing the allocating. All of it running continuously, all of it drawing power, all of it generating heat, all of it requiring water to cool the heat, all of it dependent on a grid that's 6 gigawatts short of where it needs to be by 2027, according to the most detailed reliability analysis available from the most rigorous grid operator in the country. All of it quietly studied, with the patience that only a sovereign state can sustain by actors whose interest in the continuity of these systems is not benevolent. And most of the people whose lives are organized around the outputs of these machines do not know any of this. They know that AI is reshaping industries and changing things, and that there are complicated debates about what it means for employment and creativity and privacy and democracy. They do not know that a single data center cluster used 6% of an Iowa district's entire water supply in 1 month to train the model that they now use to draft emails. They do not know that the grid operator serving 65 million people is projecting a reliability shortfall in 2 years that no precedent in that operator's history has prepared it to manage. They do not know that the Chinese state-sponsored actors who are undetected inside a Massachusetts utility for 300 days may already have the access they need to disrupt, at a moment of their choosing, the power systems that feed the facilities on which civilization-scale dependency has been constructed in fewer years than it took to build most highway overpasses. This is not a criticism of the people who don't know. The information required to assemble this picture is distributed across technical reports and congressional testimony, and academic journals and industry surveys that nobody in their ordinary life has any particular reason to read. The picture only becomes visible when you aggregate it, when you place the IEA electricity numbers next to the PJM reliability projections, next to the Kiteworks security research, next to the Volt Typhoon attribution documents, next to the Iowa Water District data, and let them resolve together into something coherent. What they resolve into is not a narrative of imminent catastrophe. The word catastrophe implies suddenness, and what is actually happening is slow by the standards of catastrophe, fast by the standards of infrastructure adaptation. It is a structural imbalance accumulating over years, growing more pronounced with each new data center that comes online and each quarter that passes without the corresponding grid capacity, security framework, and water governance that the scale of the infrastructure demands. The Spanish blackout of April 2025 is instructive, not because it was caused by AI infrastructure, but because it demonstrated what the failure of a modern power grid looks like when it happens to an advanced economy. One day, a country is operating normally. The next day, the trains are stopped, and the ATMs are dark and the internet has degraded, and a nation of tens of millions of people is relearning in real time how thoroughly every dimension of their lives depended on a system they had never thought about, because it had always worked. Spain's grid recovered. The investigation continued. The vulnerability it revealed remained. What distinguishes the AI power grid situation from a simple infrastructure insufficiency story is the layering. There is the electricity layer, where demand has outrun supply, and supply adaptation is operating on timescales that do not match demand timescales. There is the security layer, where the concentration of critical function in AI data centers has created target profiles that state-level adversaries are already studying, where the offensive cyber capabilities being brought to bear are accelerating faster than the defensive posture of the energy sector is improving, and where the specific security frameworks necessary for this specific infrastructure category do not yet exist. There is the water layer, where 720 billion gallons of projected annual consumption by 2028 is arriving at water systems that were designed without any provision for it. And there is the dependency layer, where each of these three resource systems has become more important and more stressed as AI has become more central to the operation of everything else. These layers are not independent, they interact. A grid operating under sustained load stress is more vulnerable to the kind of targeted disruption that a pre-positioned adversary can execute than a grid operating with comfortable reserve margins. A security team managing rapid data center interconnection is less available to monitor for the kind of slow, patient intrusion that Volt Typhoon specializes in. A regulatory system focused on electricity supply adequacy has less bandwidth for simultaneous attention to water governance and cybersecurity standards and nuclear permitting and the other dimensions of the problem that all need addressing at once. This is what compound challenges look like. Not a single massive failure arriving without warning, but multiple sustained stresses arriving simultaneously on systems designed for each of them individually and tested by none of them together. The psychological layer of this is worth naming carefully, because it describes something important about how the public relationship to this situation has developed and how it is likely to continue developing. There is a particular kind of discomfort that arises from understanding that the services and capabilities one has come to depend upon are built on foundations that are simultaneously more fragile and more consequential than the ease of access to those services suggests. The electricity flows when you flip the switch. The AI responds when you type the query. The system works day after day with a reliability that does not reveal the stress it is operating under, because the stress is absorbed by the margins and the reserve capacity and the emergency protocols and the professional dedication of people whose job it is to keep the system working precisely so that everyone else never has to think about whether it will. The people whose job it is to keep the system working, the grid operators and the utility planners and the security teams and the water managers and the regulators who set the standards they operate under, are thinking about it. The PJM reliability report that identified a 6 gigawatt shortfall by 2027 is the output of people doing exactly their job, looking far enough ahead to see problems before they become failures and saying clearly enough what they see to give the people with the authority to respond some chance of responding in time. The Kiteworks research identifying 9% AI red teaming rates is the output of analysts doing their job, measuring the gap between what the threat environment requires and what the operational posture provides, and making that gap legible to the people who have the authority to close it. The Food and Water Watch projections of 720 billion gallons of annual data center water consumption by 2028 are the output of researchers doing their job, quantifying a resource demand that is growing faster than governance frameworks are adapting, and making that quantification available to policymakers who have the authority to require the disclosures that would enable better planning. All of these are signals. They are clear signals available to anyone willing to read them. And the question that the coming years will answer is whether the amplitude of those signals is sufficient to produce the response that the situation requires, on the timeline that matters, before the margins are exhausted and the reserve capacity is consumed, and the system that everyone depends upon and almost no one thinks about arrives at a moment that forces attention in the worst possible way. There is a line in the thermodynamics of complex systems that engineers call the failure threshold. Below it, a system under stress continues to function, absorbing disruptions and recovering, maintaining the outward appearance of normalcy even as internal stresses accumulate. Above it, the system transitions, not always dramatically, sometimes gradually, but irreversibly, in the sense that the conditions that existed before the threshold was crossed cannot be restored simply by removing the stressor. The grid that has been pushed too long without adequate reserve capacity does not spring back to resilience the moment new generation is added. The aquifer that has been depleted faster than it recharges does not recover on the timescale relevant to the communities whose water systems depend on it. The security architecture that has allowed persistent adversary access for 300 days does not become secure the moment the intrusion is detected and the immediate access is revoked. Below the failure threshold, there is time. Time for grid planners to bring new capacity online. Time for security frameworks to be developed and implemented. Time for water governance to catch up with data center demand. Time for the regulatory structures to close the gaps that rapid deployment has created. Below the threshold, the resources and the will to act, if assembled, can produce outcomes that are meaningfully different from the current trajectory. The evidence assembled across this discussion does not establish that the failure threshold has been crossed. What it establishes is that the trajectory toward it is real, measurable, and moving faster than the adaptation of the systems designed to prevent it. That is a different statement, and it is a statement that carries a different kind of weight, not the weight of crisis already arrived, but the weight of decision still available. The machines are still running, the grid is still holding, the water is still flowing, the security teams are still monitoring, the grid planners are still planning, the researchers are still measuring and publishing and testifying, the policymakers are still debating and legislating and regulating, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that democratic systems with multiple competing interests and finite attention always do, and the data centers are still being built, and the AI capabilities they house are still expanding, and the electricity they require is still being demanded of a grid that was designed for a quieter world, and the water they consume is still being drawn from systems that were sized for demands that did not include them, and the adversaries who have noticed what has been built and what it depends upon, and where the threads are that, if pulled at the right moment, would produce the largest unravelling, are still watching. This is not the end of the story. It is not even the middle. It is the early chapter, the part where the conditions are being established, the part where the decisions being made today are determining the shape of events that will arrive later, the part where the awareness of the trajectory still has time to influence where the trajectory leads. The quiet in the machine is not the quiet of a stable system at rest. It is the quiet of a system under load, absorbing stress, maintaining the surface appearance of normalcy, while the internal conditions that will determine its future accumulate beneath the surface. It is the quiet of a grid running close to its limits in the dark hours of the morning, when demand dips and the reserve margins look adequate and nothing has failed yet. It is the quiet before the answers to the open questions arrive in the form of events rather than analysis. Before the grid shortfall becomes a reliability incident, before the security gap becomes an attributed attack on energy infrastructure, before the water competition becomes an acute regional crisis, before the dependency loop closes tightly enough that the people living inside it become aware of the loop for the first time. The servers are running, the grid is holding, the water is flowing, the adversaries are watching, the analysts are measuring, the policymakers are deliberating, and somewhere in Iowa, on a quiet night, in a building lit from within by the heat of thousands of processors thinking on behalf of a civilization that depends on them and does not know them, 6% of the district's water supply is flowing through the cooling systems, keeping the machines at the temperature that computation requires, keeping the queries answered, keeping the outputs generating, keeping the systems operational. For now, that is where the story is. Right there, in that for now. In the distance between what the system is currently doing and what it was built to do. In the space between the demand that is accelerating and the infrastructure that is adapting. In the gap that is 6 gigawatts wide and growing. Everything that happens next will happen in that gap, and how it happens, and on what timeline and under what conditions, is still, at this moment, undetermined. That is the most honest thing that can be said about where things stand, and honesty in a situation this consequential is worth more than reassurance.